What if one morning you woke up and realized that the life you had been living, the title you carried, and the family you thought was yours had all been built on a lie? Imagine for a moment what it would feel like to suddenly question the foundation of your very identity, to look in the mirror and wonder whether the face staring back at you was ever truly meant to belong to the family it had been tied to since birth. This is not a fictional story. It is the haunting, deeply emotional reality of Prince Harry as whispers turned to suspicion, and suspicion eventually led to a devastating revelation that would shake him to his core. At the center of this revelation stood King Charles, his father, the man whose approval Harry had chased for a lifetime, finally confessing what had been hidden in shadows for decades. James Hewitt, the cavalry officer known once for a scandalous affair with Princess Diana, might in fact be Harry's real father. The world has often seen Prince Harry as the spirited, rebellious younger son of Charles and Diana, the spare, whose life seemed to exist in the shadow of his elder brother, Prince William. From his earliest years, Harry's smile, his mischief, and his sense of humor made him a favorite of the public. But beneath that charm was a young boy battling with grief, identity, and constant scrutiny. After Diana's tragic death, Harry's pain was amplified by a press that refused to let him grieve in peace. He was hounded, chased, and mocked, every misstep magnified into a global scandal. Yet through all of this, there was a deeper wound festering beneath the surface, one that not even he could fully articulate: the unrelenting rumors that he wasn't Charles's son at all. For decades, the press made side-by-side comparisons of Harry and James Hewitt, pointing to the striking red hair, the facial features, the mannerisms. Each headline stung like salt on an open wound. And for Harry, no matter how many times he heard the palace deny the claims, the whispers refused to disappear. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The introduction to this story must begin where Harry's struggles first took root: the fragile foundation of identity. Growing up in one of the most scrutinized families on earth meant that nothing was ever truly his. His childhood, his grief, his romances, even his mistakes, everything belonged to the public. But identity is not just about public perception. It is about knowing who you are at your very core. Imagine being a young man constantly told you don't look like your father, that your very existence might be proof of betrayal, that you may be the child of a scandal. How does one grow into adulthood under such a shadow? For Harry, this doubt, whether ignored or confronted, was a ghost that followed him everywhere. And eventually, ghosts always demand to be faced. To understand the weight of this revelation, we must step back to the story of Diana and James Hewitt. Their affair is one of the most infamous in royal history, a chapter of betrayal and vulnerability that Diana herself openly admitted. In those years, Diana was trapped in a loveless marriage with Charles, a man whose heart openly belonged to Camilla Parker Bowles. She found in Hewitt not just companionship, but an escape, a place where she felt seen and wanted. It was during this period that Harry was born, and although palace officials insisted that Diana's relationship with Hewitt began after Harry's birth, the timelines were never enough to silence speculation. The resemblance between Harry and Hewitt became one of the most enduring points of gossip in royal circles and the tabloid press. Each photograph, each gesture, each smile became a weapon used to undermine Harry's identity. And though he never publicly admitted it, Harry could not help but internalize the question: what if it was true? Harry's adulthood only heightened the tension. His struggles with the press, his resentment toward the constraints of royal duty, and his eventual move away from the family with Meghan Markle painted him as a man desperate to break free. But breaking free from an institution is one thing. Breaking free from the truth of who you are is another. Behind closed doors, Harry reached a breaking point. The constant speculation was no longer a whisper. It had become an unbearable roar. And so, for the first time, he demanded answers. This demand set into motion one of the most heart-wrenching conversations of his life. King Charles had always carried a complicated relationship with Harry. While William was the heir, the golden boy, Harry often felt he was the afterthought. Charles, consumed by duty, reputation, and his enduring love for Camilla, rarely offered Harry the emotional reassurance he craved. Their relationship was one of distance, duty, and unspoken words. And yet, Charles was still his father, or at least, Harry believed he was. That fragile bond, tested countless times, was about to be shattered by a confession no son should ever have to hear. When Charles finally sat down with Harry to face the question, the weight of decades pressed down on both men. For Charles, it was the guilt of silence. For Harry, it was the terror of hearing what he had always feared. This revelation did not come as a simple statement. It came as an apology from a father who had failed to protect his son from relentless rumors. An apology from a man who admitted he could no longer hold back the truth. The words Charles spoke were heavy with sorrow. That the rumors Harry had spent his life hearing were not entirely unfounded. That James Hewitt was not merely a figure of scandal, but may in fact be the man who gave Harry life. Imagine, for a moment, hearing those words from the person you had always believed was your father. Imagine the world around you collapsing, not just because of the betrayal, but because of the final confirmation of your deepest fear. For Harry, this was not just about paternity. It was about betrayal at the highest level, a betrayal that cut into the very essence of who he believed he was. The introduction to this exposé does not seek to provide the final answer. That is for the story itself to reveal in all its twists and turns. Instead, it seeks to prepare the viewer for a journey of identity, betrayal, and emotional reckoning. It sets the stage for a story that is not just about royalty or scandal, but about humanity itself. For in Harry's story lies a universal truth. The desperate need to belong, to know who we are, and to understand the truth of our origins. And when that truth is denied, hidden, or manipulated, the consequences can be devastating. This is a story of a man who has lived under the heaviest crown of all, the crown of doubt. It is a story of whispers that became shouts, of secrets that refused to stay buried, of a son betrayed by silence, and a father crushed by guilt. As we journey deeper into the chapters ahead, we will see how this revelation rippled through the palace walls, how it fractured the fragile bond between brothers, how it sparked a media firestorm that shook the monarchy, and how it forced Harry to confront the truth of who he is. But before we dive into those chapters, one question must linger in the mind of every viewer. If the blood that defines your family was not the blood that runs through your veins, would you still know who you are? And so, this is where the story begins. With a prince who is no longer sure if he was ever truly a prince at all, a son who may not be his father's child, and a monarchy forced to confront the consequences of secrets kept too long. What comes next is not just the tale of Harry's heartbreak. It is the unraveling of one of the greatest mysteries to ever haunt the royal family. The story of Prince Harry's life cannot be told without acknowledging the persistent cloud of speculation that hovered above him since his earliest days. It was not the kind of rumor that fades into obscurity after a few fleeting headlines. Instead, it was the sort of unrelenting gossip that grew louder as he grew older, echoing in newsstands, whispers at dinner tables, and even casual conversations among those who claimed to know the truth better than the man himself. From his teenage years through adulthood, the question of whether Harry was truly the son of King Charles or the product of Diana's scandalous affair with cavalry officer James Hewitt haunted him like a shadow that refused to be shaken off. This chapter will explore how those whispers began, how they grew into a cultural obsession, and how they slowly began to erode Harry's peace of mind. The doubts first surfaced in the late 1980s and early 1990s, when the world was fascinated by Princess Diana's struggles within her troubled marriage to Charles. Their relationship had already shown cracks. Charles's open affection for Camilla Parker Bowles contrasted sharply with Diana's isolation and despair. The press devoured every detail of the young princess's unhappiness, and it was during this fragile time that Diana's connection to James Hewitt emerged. The timeline of their affair, combined with Harry's striking red hair and facial resemblance to Hewitt, gave rise to speculation that would follow Harry for the rest of his life. Even though palace insiders insisted Diana and Hewitt began their relationship after Harry's birth, the public was never satisfied. The human mind, hungry for scandal and eager for explanations, clung to the theory that Harry was not Charles's biological child. It didn't help that Harry's physical features were endlessly compared to his brothers. William, the heir, bore a strong resemblance to both Charles and Diana, a mixture that felt unquestionably royal. Harry, by contrast, stood out. His red hair, his distinct facial structure, his spirited personality. These qualities made him different, and difference became the fertile soil in which rumor thrives. Tabloid newspapers published side-by-side photographs of Harry and Hewitt, exaggerating their similarities, while commentators and royal watchers offered speculative remarks on late-night talk shows and magazine interviews. To the world, it was an amusing story of scandal, but for Harry, it was the seed of a personal crisis. As a child, Harry could not have fully understood the weight of such whispers. But children are not oblivious. They notice when adults exchange glances, when jokes are made at their expense, or when questions linger a little too long. The British tabloids did not protect him. Headlines would boldly suggest questions of paternity, and schoolmates who absorbed these stories would throw cruel remarks his way. Being called the illegitimate prince or the son of Hewitt was not just playground teasing. It was a direct assault on the fragile sense of identity every child builds. For Harry, the rumors were not abstract gossip. They were daggers aimed at his very existence. By the time Harry entered adolescence, the whispers had become impossible to ignore. His teenage years were already turbulent, marked by rebellion, brushes with scandal, and visible frustration with his role in the royal family. To the outside world, this seemed like youthful defiance, but beneath the surface, much of it was rooted in pain. Imagine being told over and over that the man you call your father might not be your father at all. Imagine trying to develop a sense of belonging while the public questions whether you belong to your family in the first place. Harry's drinking, his late-night partying, his willingness to challenge royal expectations. All of these behaviors were as much about resisting the burden of royal duty as they were about coping with an identity crisis that would not relent. The cruelest part of the whispers was how public they became. The speculation wasn't confined to gossip columns. It was immortalized in books, documentaries, and interviews. When James Hewitt himself spoke publicly about his relationship with Diana, denying that he was Harry's father, the denial did little to silence the rumors. In fact, the very act of discussing it reignited speculation. Every time the subject was raised, Harry was forced to relive the pain of uncertainty. It wasn't just that strangers doubted his identity. It was that he himself began to wonder if there was something to the story. The royal family, known for their stoic silence, refused to directly address the rumors. Their refusal was meant to dismiss the gossip, but in many ways, it fueled it further. Silence, after all, can be mistaken for guilt. The lack of a firm denial from Charles or the institution left room for the speculation to breathe, and breathe it did. Tabloid culture in the 1990s thrived on such ambiguity. The more the palace stayed silent, the more the press filled the void with sensationalism. For Harry, this silence from his family cut deeper than the headlines themselves. What he needed was reassurance, a firm and unshakable statement of truth. What he received was avoidance. Even when friends or mentors tried to reassure him, pointing out timelines and denying the possibility, Harry could never fully escape doubt. His own eyes betrayed him when he looked at photographs of Hewitt and saw echoes of himself. His own ears betrayed him when he heard strangers mutter about resemblance. And his own heart betrayed him when he considered his strained relationship with Charles, a man who often seemed more duty than father, more crown than parent. Could the coldness between them be explained by a truth neither dared speak? Could Charles's distance be the distance of a man raising a child he knew was not his own? These questions festered in Harry's mind like wounds left untreated. The whispers of doubt followed Harry even as he entered military service. Among comrades, where camaraderie should have been a sanctuary, jokes about his parentage sometimes surfaced. They may have been said in jest, the sort of banter soldiers use to break tension, but for Harry, they cut to the core. A soldier can endure hardship, but enduring a question of identity, especially one that cannot be answered, is a torment few can imagine. Harry wore his uniform with pride, yet even in service, he could not escape the rumors tied to his birth. By the time Harry reached adulthood, the whispers had become less about gossip and more about a defining feature of his public image. He could not sit for an interview, attend a public event, or be featured in a documentary without the shadow of Hewitt being raised in some capacity. The public had made the rumor part of his identity, and there was no escape from it. Even Meghan Markle, when she entered his life, could not fully shield him from the constant comparisons. Together, they faced the press as a united front, but privately, the whispers still reached Harry's ears. The pain never left, and the need for answers only grew stronger. In these whispers lay the foundation for the story that was to come. They were not simply rumors. They were the slow-burning fuse to an explosion waiting to happen. Each comparison, each headline, each silence from the palace was another inch of fuse burned away. And when the fuse finally reached its end, it would detonate in a revelation that would shake Harry, Charles, and the monarchy itself. This chapter of Whispers is where Harry's emotional unraveling began. It was here, in the cruel persistence of gossip, that the seed of doubt took root and grew into the unshakable question that consumed him. Who am I, really? The rest of his story cannot be understood without acknowledging this first and most devastating wound. For it is one thing to be criticized for your actions, but it is another entirely to have the very essence of your identity questioned again and again until you begin to question it yourself. Harry's life was shaped not only by the immense expectations of his royal role, but also by the deep uncertainty gnawing at his sense of self. Being born into the monarchy meant he was already destined for a life in the spotlight. Yet unlike William, who grew up with the clear understanding that he would one day be king, Harry was marked with a title that haunted him: the Spare. It may sound like a harmless word, a simple royal designation, but for Harry, it was a constant reminder that he was never truly the priority. Every choice he made, every step he took, was seen through the lens of comparison to William. William was the heir, the embodiment of continuity, the symbol of stability. Harry, by contrast, was often viewed as expendable, someone necessary only as a backup, someone whose existence was defined by contingency rather than purpose. This struggle with identity became all the more profound when mixed with the whispers of doubt about his true paternity. If he wasn't Charles's son, then what was he? If he wasn't royal by blood, what role did he truly have in the family that defined itself by lineage and heritage? The palace was built on tradition, on bloodlines traced through centuries, on names and titles carried through generations. To be told, even in rumor, that you might not belong to that chain of history is to be told you might not exist in the only way that mattered in that world. Harry was not just struggling to define himself against the shadow of William. He was struggling to define himself against the possibility that he wasn't even part of the royal family at all. The cracks in his identity began to show in his teenage years. While William carried himself with a reserved sense of duty, Harry leaned into rebellion. He smoked, he drank, he got into fights with paparazzi, and his name appeared in tabloids for all the wrong reasons. The press labeled him the wild child, but what they failed to grasp was the pain behind the rebellion. Rebellion is rarely just about defiance. It is often a cry for recognition. Harry wasn't lashing out because he enjoyed scandal. He was lashing out because he felt unseen. Growing up with the constant question of whether he was truly his father's son made him question whether anyone in the palace truly cared for him as he was, or whether they tolerated him because they had to. His schooling years only deepened these insecurities. Harry was often compared unfavorably to William in academics, in demeanor, in presentation. William excelled where Harry struggled. Teachers noted Harry's restlessness, his difficulty focusing, his need for constant validation. These were not signs of laziness. They were signs of a boy searching for purpose. If your birthright is uncertain, what drives you forward? If you are constantly told, directly or indirectly, that you are secondary, how do you find value in yourself? These were the questions that shaped Harry's internal battles long before the world saw him as a man. One of the most defining aspects of Harry's struggle with identity was his relationship with the media. The press that hounded Diana now turned their attention to her son, feeding off his missteps and mistakes. Harry became the easy target, the one who could be ridiculed without much consequence. William had to be protected, but Harry? Harry was fair game. Photographs of him in compromising positions, stories of him at parties, accusations of irresponsibility, they all became part of the narrative that Harry was unstable, unfit, or lost. To the public, it was entertainment. To Harry, it was a confirmation of his greatest fear, that he was not good enough, not royal enough, not legitimate enough. His service in the military became a temporary refuge. In uniform, Harry found structure, purpose, and a sense of equality. The army didn't care about his title. It cared about his actions. But even there, the rumors followed him. Jokes about his resemblance to James Hewitt resurfaced in barracks and casual conversation. They may have been delivered as harmless banter, but for Harry, they struck deeply. The army offered him brotherhood, but it could not silence the doubts that followed him everywhere. Even on the front lines, even when risking his life, he was not just Harry the soldier. He was Harry, the boy whose father might not be his father. His adult years brought new layers to this struggle. Marriage to Meghan Markle was supposed to be a turning point, a chance to redefine himself outside of the monarchy. Together, they dreamed of building a life free from the suffocating traditions of the crown. But even in California, oceans away from the palace, Harry could not escape his identity crisis. Critics called him weak for leaving, mocked him as being controlled by Meghan, and accused him of abandoning his duty. To the royal establishment, he was betraying centuries of tradition. To the tabloids, he was an endless source of scandal. To himself, he was still that boy haunted by whispers of illegitimacy, still searching for where he truly belonged. The irony of Harry's struggle is that it paralleled his mother's. Diana had also struggled with identity, with being thrust into a role that demanded perfection while offering little compassion. She too had felt like an outsider in the royal family, judged more for appearances than for who she truly was. In many ways, Harry inherited not just her looks and charm, but also her deep vulnerability. Diana found solace in Hewitt, and Harry, decades later, found himself entangled in the legacy of that solace. It was not just about whether Hewitt was his father, it was about whether he belonged anywhere at all. Harry's memoirs, interviews, and public statements over the years reveal glimpses of this struggle. His descriptions of feeling like a spare, of never being prioritized, of seeking love and approval in places where he rarely found it. All of these threads tie back to the central theme of his life: identity. He has always been searching for who he is, not as a prince, not as a spare, but as Harry. Yet when the foundation of your very birth is questioned, that search becomes almost impossible. Identity is not just about titles or bloodlines. It is about the stories we tell ourselves. But Harry's story was one he could not fully control. The palace dictated the narrative, the media manipulated it, and the public consumed it. His own voice was drowned out. Every time he tried to assert himself, whether by serving in the army, by marrying Meghan, or by stepping back from royal duties, his choices were reframed as scandal, betrayal, or weakness. And so his identity crisis only deepened. He was not just battling the whispers of doubt about his parentage. He was battling the louder, more insidious question of whether he mattered at all. What makes Harry's struggle so compelling is that it is not unique to royalty. At its heart, it is the universal struggle of every human being. The need to belong, the need to be valued, the need to know who we are. But for Harry, this struggle played out on the world stage, magnified by cameras and headlines, distorted by agendas he could not control. The pain of being uncertain about your own identity is devastating enough in private. Imagine enduring it under the gaze of millions. And so, as whispers of doubt grew louder, as the palace remained silent, as the press mocked him and the public debated his very existence, Harry's struggle with identity became the defining battle of his life. It was a battle fought not with swords or politics, but with questions that cut deeper than any wound. Who am I? Do I belong? Am I truly royal, or am I just the product of a scandal too explosive to ever fully expose? The answers to these questions would not come easily. They would demand confrontation, revelation, and heartbreak. They would demand a father's apology, a son's tears, and a family's reckoning. But before any of that could unfold, Harry had to endure the hardest part of all: the waiting, the uncertainty, the struggle of living in the in-between. This was not just the struggle of a prince. It was the struggle of a man lost in the labyrinth of identity, desperate for truth, desperate for belonging, desperate for peace. To understand the full weight of Harry's story, one cannot escape the chapter of history that has been replayed in whispers and headlines for decades: the relationship between Princess Diana and James Hewitt. It is a story steeped in betrayal, vulnerability, and longing. It is also a story that became one of the most notorious scandals in modern royal history. The very existence of this affair was enough to shake the foundation of the monarchy, but its shadow extended much further. It became the lens through which Harry's life was viewed, the breeding ground for the most persistent rumors about his identity. Diana's marriage to Charles was famously fraught from the beginning. While it had been heralded to the world as a fairy tale, the reality was anything but. Diana herself described it as a marriage with 3 people in it, a direct reference to Camilla Parker Bowles. From the outset, Charles's affections for Camilla overshadowed his relationship with Diana, and what should have been a partnership between husband and wife quickly became a performance for the public. Diana was left feeling isolated, unwanted, and betrayed. She was adored by the public, but unseen by the man whose love she had once longed for. The palace walls may have looked solid to the outside world, but behind them was a woman crumbling under emotional neglect. It was in this climate of loneliness and despair that Diana crossed paths with James Hewitt. A cavalry officer in the household division, Hewitt entered Diana's life initially as a riding instructor. What began as lessons quickly grew into something deeper. Diana, feeling unloved and unappreciated by her husband, found in Hewitt the warmth, attention, and affection she had been deprived of. Their connection was not just physical, it was emotional. Hewitt became her confidant, someone she could trust in a world where trust was a rare commodity. For Diana, the affair was less about defiance and more about survival. In Hewitt, she discovered the validation Charles denied her, the companionship she desperately craved. The affair lasted for several years, running parallel to the crumbling facade of Diana's marriage. At a time when the royal family demanded silence and composure, Diana's actions spoke of rebellion and vulnerability. She was a woman trying to reclaim her sense of worth, and though the relationship was clandestine, its echoes would eventually be heard around the world. When the truth surfaced, it shook the palace to its core. The very idea that the Princess of Wales had sought comfort in another man was enough to stain the royal image, but the implications of that man being James Hewitt created an even greater storm. For the public, the most tantalizing detail was the timing of the affair. Diana herself confirmed in interviews that the relationship began after Harry's birth, insisting that Hewitt could not be Harry's father. Yet for conspiracy-hungry tabloids, the timeline was an open question. Diana and Hewitt's closeness, coupled with Harry's physical resemblance to him, was too enticing a story to let die. The affair became more than just a scandal. It became the supposed origin story for one of the most talked-about princes in history. James Hewitt did not escape unscathed either. Once the affair became public, he was hounded by reporters, his name forever tied to Diana's. What had once been a private relationship became a public spectacle. His military career suffered, his personal life collapsed, and he became a reluctant figure of infamy. Yet no matter how much he tried to separate himself from the rumor, the shadow of his relationship with Diana followed him relentlessly. He was no longer just James Hewitt, the cavalry officer. He was James Hewitt, the alleged father of Harry. The scandal reached its peak when Diana herself openly admitted to the affair during the infamous Panorama interview in 1995. In that televised confession, she acknowledged her relationship with Hewitt, speaking candidly about the pain of her marriage and her search for affection elsewhere. The admission was explosive. For the monarchy, it was a humiliation, proof that the fairy tale had long since turned into tragedy. For the public, it was confirmation of the whispers they had long suspected. And for Harry, though still a teenager, it was the moment when the whispers about his paternity became inescapable. Imagine being 15 years old, grieving the death of your mother just 2 years later, while the world around you speculates that you are the living proof of her infidelity. That is the reality Harry faced. The affair between Diana and Hewitt had ended years earlier, but its legacy lived on in him, whether he wanted it or not. The media seized upon every resemblance, every rumor, every timeline discrepancy, weaving them into a narrative that Harry could never quite escape. What made the scandal even more damaging was the way it intersected with Diana's public image. Diana was adored by the people, seen as a saint-like figure of compassion and vulnerability. Yet her humanity, her affair with Hewitt, was used as a weapon against her son. The same public that worshipped her simultaneously used her choices to question Harry's legitimacy. For Harry, this duality was painful. How could he both honor his mother's memory and live under the shadow of the choices she made? How could he reconcile the love he felt for her with the rumors that her affair had defined his very existence? The palace's handling of the affair only compounded the issue. Silence was the royal family's chosen weapon, but silence can sometimes scream louder than words. By refusing to address the speculation head-on, the monarchy allowed the narrative to spiral out of control. The absence of a firm denial became, in the eyes of many, a tacit admission. For Harry, the palace's refusal to protect him from these rumors felt like abandonment. It was yet another way in which he was left to fight battles alone, while the institution prioritized image over the well-being of the boy at the center of the storm. In later years, Hewitt attempted to dispel the rumors directly. He gave interviews in which he stated unequivocally that he was not Harry's father. He pointed out that his relationship with Diana began after Harry was already born. But by then, the damage was done. Once a rumor embeds itself into the public consciousness, it is almost impossible to erase. Denials only rekindle interest. For every statement Hewitt made, there was another headline asking the same question. Was he telling the truth, or was he protecting Diana's legacy? Eventually, Harry began to seek therapy, admitting in candid interviews that he could no longer carry the burden alone. Therapy became a lifeline, a place where he could begin to untangle the layers of pain he had been carrying for decades. He spoke of learning to process his grief, his anger, and his fear, but therapy also forced him to confront the one question he had avoided all his life: the truth of who he was. Could he ever truly heal if the whispers of doubt were never addressed? Could he ever find peace if he continued to live with uncertainty about his own bloodline? The culmination of these struggles led Harry to a moment of reckoning. He realized he could no longer live with unanswered questions. His breaking point became the catalyst for confrontation, a demand for clarity that he could no longer suppress. He needed to know the truth, even if the truth destroyed him. He could not build a future for himself, for Meghan, or for his children while living under the shadow of a question that had defined him for decades. That demand for truth would ultimately lead him to a private and painful confrontation with Charles. It was not an easy decision to make. To question your father about whether he is truly your father is to open the door to devastation. But Harry had reached the edge. He could not move forward without answers. His breaking point was not just about anger or rebellion. It was about survival. He needed to reclaim control of his life, and that meant facing the possibility that the rumors were true. This chapter in Harry's story is perhaps the most human of all. It reveals a man who, despite wealth, status, and fame, struggled with the same questions that haunt countless others. Who am I? Where do I belong? Am I loved for who I am, or tolerated because of who I am supposed to be? For Harry, the weight of these questions was amplified by the crown he carried and the relentless gaze of the world. His breaking point was not a weakness, but a testament to his humanity, a moment where the need for truth became greater than the fear of pain. In the end, Harry's breaking point was the beginning of the unraveling of secrets long kept in silence. It marked the transition from whispers to confrontation, from doubt to revelation. It was the moment when a son, broken by decades of pain, finally gathered the strength to demand the answers that would change his life forever. The confrontation between Harry and King Charles was inevitable. After years of silence, decades of rumors, and the mounting weight of an identity crisis that had pushed him to the edge, Harry could no longer live with unanswered questions. The whispers had been relentless, the media unforgiving, and his own heart merciless in its constant questioning. The time had come to demand clarity, to force the truth into the open, no matter how devastating it might be. For Harry, confronting Charles was not just about resolving rumors. It was about reclaiming his life. For Charles, it was about facing the consequences of years of silence and avoidance. The setting of this confrontation was not grand or public. It was private, deliberate, and charged with emotion. Harry chose the moment carefully, knowing that the conversation would change everything. He had carried this weight for too long, and while therapy and Meghan's support had given him the courage to face it, the fear of the answer remained. What if Charles admitted what Harry had always feared? What if the man he had called father all his life finally confessed that the blood between them was not shared? These questions burned in Harry's mind as he walked into the room. Charles, for his part, had long known this confrontation would one day arrive. He had lived with the rumors as well, seeing the headlines, hearing the comparisons, and enduring the cruel speculation. Yet instead of addressing it directly with Harry, he had chosen silence, hoping that avoidance would somehow shield them both. But silence had not been protection, it had been poison. Each year of avoidance only deepened Harry's suspicion and resentment. Each day without clarity was another day of pain. When Harry finally stood before him, demanding answers, Charles knew that silence was no longer an option. The conversation began with hesitation. Harry's voice carried the weight of decades, shaking with both anger and vulnerability. He asked the question bluntly, was it true? Was James Hewitt his real father? The room grew heavy with the enormity of the moment. For Charles, answering this question was not simply about facts. It was about admitting his own failures as a father. He had watched his son struggle, watched him be tormented by the press, watched him carry the burden of whispers, and yet he had done nothing to ease the pain. Now, forced into the corner, he had to respond. Charles began not with denial, but with an apology. He admitted that he should have spoken sooner, that his silence had been a mistake. He confessed that he had wanted to shield Harry from the ugliness of the truth, but in doing so had only caused more harm. For Harry, hearing the word apology was both shocking and devastating. Apologies were rare in the royal family, where image and duty often outweighed personal honesty. To hear his father apologize was to hear an admission that something was indeed deeply wrong. The apology, however, was not enough. Harry demanded the truth. He wanted to know whether the man he had called father all his life was truly his father or whether the rumors were true. The moment stretched unbearably, Charles struggling to find the words, Harry desperate for clarity. Finally, Charles admitted that the rumors were not entirely unfounded. While he insisted that Diana had claimed the affair with Hewitt began after Harry's birth, he acknowledged that the timeline and the speculation had left room for doubt, and that he could no longer categorically deny what the world had long believed. For Harry, this half-admission was crushing. It was not the firm denial he had hoped for, nor the reassurance he desperately needed. It was an acknowledgement of doubt, an opening of the door to the possibility that he might not be Charles's son at all. The man he had confronted for truth had given him ambiguity instead, an apology laced with uncertainty. It was both everything and nothing. The weight of that moment pressed down on Harry, and tears filled his eyes. All he wanted was a clear answer, but what he received was a father's admission of guilt and a cloud of unresolved truth. The confrontation did not end with shouting, but with silence. Both men sat in the gravity of the moment, knowing that their relationship would never be the same again. For Harry, the confrontation was both liberating and devastating. He had forced the truth into the open, but the truth was not clean. It was messy, painful, and unresolved. For Charles, the confrontation was the culmination of years of avoidance finally collapsing. He had failed to protect his son, failed to shield him from rumors, and failed to provide the clarity a father owes his child. The confrontation rippled beyond that room. It marked the beginning of a fracture that would extend through the family. William, once Harry's closest ally, would learn of the conversation and struggle with its implications. Camilla, long seen as the source of tension in the family, would become a silent presence in the aftermath. The palace, ever concerned with image, would scramble to contain the fallout. But the damage had been done. The truth, or at least the admission of doubt, had been spoken, and nothing could erase it. This chapter in Harry's life was not just about confronting his father. It was about confronting himself. In demanding answers, he proved that he could no longer be defined by silence or shadows. He had to face the truth, even if the truth broke him. And in confronting Charles, he also confronted the institution itself, forcing the monarchy to reckon with the consequences of secrecy and silence. Harry walked away from that confrontation changed. He was no longer the boy haunted by whispers. He was the man who had faced them head-on. The answers were not complete, the pain was not resolved, but the silence had been shattered. And in that shattering lay the beginning of a new chapter, one in which the truth, however painful, could no longer be hidden. There are moments in life that carve themselves so deeply into memory that they never fade, no matter how much time passes. For Harry, one of those moments was hearing his father, King Charles, apologize. It was not the kind of apology that wipes away pain with a few well-chosen words, nor was it the sort of carefully polished statement designed for public consumption. It was raw, hesitant, and burdened with years of silence and guilt. But it was also an acknowledgement that the unspoken had finally been forced into the open. For a son who had spent decades questioning, doubting, and suffering, those words marked both a breaking point and a turning point. The apology came after Harry's blunt question about his paternity. His demand had left no room for evasion, and Charles, cornered by his son's anguish, chose honesty over silence. His first words were not of denial but of regret. He admitted that he should have done more to shield Harry from the rumors, that he should have spoken up when the press weaponized whispers against him, that he should have been a father before he was a monarch. For Harry, those words carried a weight that was almost unbearable. His entire life he had wanted acknowledgement, not just of his existence within the family, but of the pain he had endured. Hearing Charles apologize was a validation that he had been wronged, that his suffering had not been imagined. But the apology was complicated. It was not a clear dismissal of the rumors, nor a firm confirmation. Instead, it was an admission of guilt for allowing doubt to consume Harry's life. Charles spoke of the affair between Diana and James Hewitt, reiterating Diana's claim that the relationship began after Harry's birth, but he also confessed that he could never escape the speculation himself. He admitted that the resemblance between Harry and Hewitt had haunted him too, and that his silence was in part because he could not bear to confront the possibility head-on. These words were perhaps the most painful for Harry. They revealed that even his father, the man who should have been his anchor, had lived with doubt. Harry's reaction was a storm of emotions. There was anger, directed not just at Charles, but at the years of avoidance. There was grief, for the boy inside him who had been left unprotected. There was relief, too, that the silence had finally been broken. But most of all, there was heartbreak. To hear his father apologize not as a monarch, but as a man who admitted failure was to realize that the image of strength he had clung to was flawed all along. Harry had wanted certainty. Instead, he was given regret. He had wanted answers. Instead, he was given apologies. The apology itself reshaped the dynamics between father and son. Harry no longer saw Charles as the untouchable figure who could remain above the fray of rumor and scandal. He saw him as a man, fallible, fragile, and burdened with his own insecurities. For Charles, offering that apology was an act of vulnerability he had long avoided. The monarchy is built on the idea of infallibility, of never admitting weakness, of never revealing too much humanity. In apologizing, Charles stepped outside of that mold. For a brief moment, he was not king. He was a father confronting the damage his silence had caused. Yet the apology also carried consequences. By admitting guilt, even without confirming the rumors, Charles had cracked the carefully maintained facade of the monarchy. Within palace walls, his words became a source of tension. Advisors worried about what might happen if such a conversation ever leaked. William, learning of the apology later, struggled to reconcile it with his own understanding of their family's history. Camilla, always the quiet presence in the background, feared what it meant for the future of the crown. The apology was not just a private moment between father and son. It was a tremor that shook the foundations of the institution itself. For Harry, though, the moment was deeply personal. He replayed the words in his mind over and over, dissecting their meaning, searching for hidden truths within them. The apology did not answer his central question, who was his father? But it acknowledged his suffering, and in that acknowledgement lay a kind of truth. Sometimes, an apology is less about the details and more about validation. Charles's words validated Harry's pain in a way no denial ever could. They confirmed that the silence had been damaging, that the avoidance had been cruel, and that his struggle had not been in vain. The aftermath of the apology brought both clarity and confusion. On one hand, Harry felt liberated. He no longer had to carry the burden of silence. The confrontation had forced the truth into the open, and he could no longer be accused of living in denial. On the other hand, the lack of definitive answers left him adrift. Charles's apology gave him recognition, but not resolution. He was left to navigate the space between what was admitted and what remained unsaid. What made this apology so powerful was not its content, but its timing. Harry had reached his breaking point. He had confronted his father at a moment when he could no longer carry the burden alone. Had Charles apologized earlier, when Harry was a boy, when he was a teenager, when he was a soldier, the words might have healed more than they hurt. But now, delivered in adulthood after years of torment, the apology felt like both a balm and a wound. It soothed the pain of neglect, but deepened the grief for years lost to silence. This chapter in Harry's life underscores the complexity of fatherhood within the monarchy. Charles was both a father and a king, roles that often clashed. His duty to the crown demanded silence, while his duty to his son demanded truth. For years, he chose duty over honesty. But in apologizing, he admitted that the choice had cost him dearly. It cost him Harry's trust, his peace of mind, and the fragile bond between them. The apology, therefore, was not just about paternity. It was about years of emotional neglect, about a father finally admitting that he had failed to be the man his son needed. For Harry, the apology changed everything because it shifted the narrative. No longer was he the boy who lived in the shadows of whispers. He became the man who had confronted his father and forced acknowledgement. He was no longer passive in the story of his life. He was active, demanding, unrelenting. And while the apology did not give him all the answers, it gave him something equally important: the courage to continue seeking them. The apology also marked the beginning of a deeper rupture between Harry and the monarchy. By admitting even partial doubt, Charles had opened the door to questions that the institution had fought to keep closed. If Harry was not truly royal by blood, what did that mean for his titles, his role, his place in the line of succession? These questions would soon ripple outward, reaching beyond private rooms into public debate. The apology was the spark that ignited the firestorm to come. For now, though, the focus remained on father and son. Two men, bound by history, divided by silence, and momentarily united in vulnerability. The apology was not perfect, nor was it complete, but it was real. And in a family built on performance, image, and restraint, reality was rare. That rarity made it unforgettable. Once the apology had been spoken and the silence broken, the next inevitable step was to confront the shadowy figure at the center of the rumors, James Hewitt. For decades, his name had been tied to Harry's identity in ways both cruel and persistent. The affair between Diana and Hewitt was no longer a secret. It had been admitted by Diana herself. What remained hidden was the true extent of its impact, particularly in relation to Harry. The world had spent years drawing connections between Harry's red hair, his resemblance to Hewitt, and the timelines of Diana's relationship. For Harry, the confrontation with his father was only one half of the puzzle. To face the truth, he needed to confront Hewitt's presence in his life, whether through fact or through perception. The Hewitt connection was not simply about physical resemblance. It was about narrative. The tabloids had used Hewitt as a weapon against Harry since childhood, turning him into a symbol of Diana's rebellion, an embodiment of scandal, and a question mark hanging over Harry's lineage. To the public, the resemblance was undeniable, and denial from the palace was never enough. Photographs of Harry and Hewitt were juxtaposed for years. Harry as a child, Harry as a teenager, Harry as a man, always placed side by side with Hewitt, as though the public itself were invited to play judge and jury. This constant comparison created a cultural obsession that made the connection feel real, regardless of what the truth actually was. For Harry, the Hewitt connection was a torment. Each time his face appeared in such comparisons, each time his name was linked to Hewitt's, it reinforced the sense of alienation from his family. He could not escape the image, nor could he escape the possibility that it might contain some truth. Even when Hewitt himself denied being Harry's father, the denials never carried the same weight as the speculation. People preferred scandal to simplicity, and so the rumors thrived. The confrontation with Charles had cracked open the possibility that even within the family, doubts lingered. Charles's half-admission that the rumors were not entirely unfounded gave new life to the Hewitt narrative. Harry could no longer dismiss it as idle gossip. If his own father had acknowledged that the resemblance and timeline created room for doubt, Then what did that mean about the man who had always been cast as the alternative? Could Hewitt truly be his biological father? And if so, what did that mean for his entire existence as a royal? The Hewitt connection also represented something larger than paternity. It represented betrayal. If the connection were true, it meant Diana's affair had resulted not just in scandal, but in a child. For Harry, this possibility was almost unbearable. It meant his life had been built on deception, that his place in the royal family was a lie, and that the pain he had carried all these years was not born from imagination, but from reality. It would mean that his identity as a prince, his titles, his duties, even his struggles as the spare, all of it was built on a foundation that was never his to begin with. The weight of these implications is why the Hewitt connection mattered so deeply. It was not about gossip. It was about legacy, heritage, and belonging. The monarchy defines itself by bloodlines. Titles, roles, and duties are passed down through generations not by merit, but by birth. If Harry's birth was not royal by blood, then his entire life within the monarchy was a contradiction. That possibility gnawed at him, and it is why the Hewitt connection was more than a tabloid fixation. It was the question that shaped his soul.